you also asked him, and you repeated that in the tweet the other day. When did you start to become afraid of Canadians? Do you think Justin Trudeau is afraid of Canadians?
And all I thought the whole time was, what were you afraid of? You know, we're sitting here in the same room. We're all Canadians. We're all adults, I think. And all you had to do was talk to us. Talk to the protesters. They came to your doorstep. What on earth are you so afraid of? Like, I do think so, because there was absolutely no reason for there not to be any dialogue.
Well, that was Eva Chipiuk, Chief Counsel for the Freedom Convoy during the Emergencies Act inquiry. And I'm David Krayden. I'm the host of Ottawa Exposed, and I'm the senior parliamentary columnist for the Western Standard. Proudly so. And here on this show, we expose the dark corridors of Ottawa, the city of federal power in this country. Now, Eva corrected me on two things when I interviewed her this week. The first was her name is Eva, not Eva. And the second was she's not really the chief counsel because she says she's part of a legal team. And that legal team was with the Freedom Convoy protesters for 6 weeks as we all sat in the Library and Archives Canada and listened to testimony about why Prime Minister Justin Trudeau invoked the Emergencies Act on February 14th, 2022. Now, I think Eva's best remembered, and why I called her the chief legal counsel, is because she did a knockout performance on November 25th, the last day of the testimony from the politicians. Didn't actually end there. We'll get into that later. The testimony continued from so-called experts the following week. But the last day of the testimony from politicians, Eva Chipiuk cross-examined Prime Minister Justin Trudeau after he had been there for hours being lobbed softball questions by government lawyers. And he smiled, he smirked, he tried to put the best face on invoking the Emergencies Act. And personally, I don't think he did a very good job of it. But when he faced Eva Chipiuk, he did a very bad job of it because he misrepresented the facts. Let's say he lied, because she asked him point blank, why did you call those who disagreed with you, the unvaccinated and those who opposed vaccine mandates, why'd you call them names? And Trudeau flatly denied that he called them names. And of course, I was there watching and listening, and I wrote a column that day, and I found the citations and the references where Justin Trudeau does, in fact, say on two occasions, once in English, once in French, that those who oppose him on vaccine mandates and the unvaccinated are racist and misogynist. She also asked Prime Minister Trudeau, why is he afraid of Canadians? And of course, that's the question Ms. Chipiuk just answered in that clip that you saw at the beginning of this broadcast. And he does seem to be afraid of Canadians, doesn't he? And it's not, he had nothing to worry about the Freedom Convoy because they weren't threatening him. They weren't threatening the government. They weren't trying to overthrow the government. This wasn't some kind of insurrection. They had no intention of even entering a federal building, and they did not. In fact, they were the cleanest bunch of protesters I ever saw. And I was there every day during the Freedom Convoy protests of February 2022. They cleaned up after themselves. They didn't leave garbage on the road or on the sidewalks. They took their signs home, did not leave them everywhere like left-wing protests I've seen where they just leave all kinds of crap after they leave. These were clean protesters. And they certainly didn't deserve to be smeared by Justin Trudeau, the mayor of Ottawa, and others who dismissed them as some kind of white supremacist, crazy people, and who were racist and misogynist and homophobic and transphobic and on and on and on. This is all nonsense. These were truckers. These were blue-collar workers. These were people of all colors I saw Sikhs and Hindus. I saw Black people, Indigenous people. They were all there. And this is something Eva emphasized. But Western Standard, we had our hands on a story last week that was incredibly fantastic. And Eva gave the story to us. She told us that the Prime Minister is getting an early secret copy of the Emergencies Act inquiry report, principally authored by Justice Paul Rouleau. Now, this is slated to come out on January 6th, and I'll tell you what happened in a few minutes as a result, I think, of Eva's social media work and my reporting on the Western Standard. But he was supposed to get a copy of this report 2 weeks in advance of everybody else. Very unusual, because any sort of inquiry report usually isn't subject to an order in council. That means the government sees it early, 2 weeks earlier than anybody else, in the media, in the official opposition, the general public. But because they invoked an order in council over this inquiry report, Trudeau is going to get a copy 2 weeks early. Now, that strikes me as very suspicious. And it struck Eva as very suspicious, because some things can happen during those 2 weeks. What if the cabinet decides to alter the document and not tell anybody? At the very least, as Eva Chipiuk pointed out in my interview, they can, in fact, get their talking points ready and prepare everything for the public relations battle. That's the very least they can do. But there's always the potential for misuse here. Now, while I was talking to Eva Chipiuk, and while we released the interview as a broadcast for the Western Standard, interestingly enough, Justice Rouleau came out and said, the copy's not going to be ready for January 6th. You're going to have to wait a little bit. So Trudeau will probably get it early, because Rouleau says the document will be finalized by February 20th. It has to be. It has to be as part of the part of the parameters of the inquiry. But Trudeau won't get it 2 weeks early. But he's still obviously going to get it earlier than everybody else. But it's interesting how Rouleau and the commission, the Public Order Emergencies Commission, reacted, obviously, to these stories. They wanted to give the story some pushback and to maintain that everything was above board with this report. Now, at the same time, we were talking about this. There was an incredibly stupid report coming out of Ottawa that made a number of, it was called the People's Commission. And it alleged that as a result of the Freedom Convoy protesters in Ottawa, people who live and work in downtown Ottawa endured several weeks of widespread human rights abuse amidst the climate of threats, fear, sexual harassment, and intimidation marked by racism, misogyny, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, and other expressions of hate and intolerance. Now, this sounds like a textbook response from people who hated the Freedom Convoy. I'm not sure the PMO didn't write this for them. But at the very least, it sounds like some sort of Bolshevik tract. And they actually allege that truck drivers drove into Ottawa residents and beat them up. Now, how ridiculous is that? How ridiculous is that? And Eva Chipiuk said to me, I do believe our Prime Minister from the top starting this rhetoric of hate and division. And who's the one that has to deal with it on the ground? It's the police. Because of the hate, divisive rhetoric that came from our Prime Minister, she told me. That's what created the chaos and fear in Ottawa, not the Freedom Convoy, not the protesters, not the truck drivers. It was Prime Minister Trudeau talking about these people as if they were just scum of the earth. This guy who's supposed to support blue-collar workers, well, ho, ho, ho. He had no time for real people who were suffering pain, loss of livelihood, loss of, in many cases, families. because of the pandemic and because they did not want to take the vaccine. So Eva will be back with me in an exclusive interview, perhaps next week, but certainly on February 20th, when this document is delivered, because we want to know what's in it. We want to know what this document says and whether Trudeau was justified in invoking the Emergencies Act by using this kind of authoritarian measure against a peaceful protest. We say no. We say he was not justified in doing this. And I know a lot of our viewers and readership at the Western Standard are saying the same thing. This was not justified. And I want to thank again Eva Chipiuk for the interview and for alerting us to what's going on. There should not be a secret report coming out. And you know what she also told me? In the subsequent hearings from so-called experts, after the politicians had all gone back, and by the way, the media was not at these secondary hearings that followed the last day of testimony from Prime Minister Trudeau. The public was not there. The media was not there. I was alerted to it by some of the organizers of the inquiry who happened to mention, oh, by the way, next week, we're going to be hearing from some experts. Guess what? These experts were all supporting Trudeau's decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. How do I know that? Because Eva told me they weren't invited. They were not invited to attend these so-called. She says that neither her nor her legal team were invited to attend the Public Order Emergency Commission sessions that occurred after Trudeau's testimony on November 25th. We didn't really know about the process. We thought we would be part of the panel discussion after 6 weeks. But she says after those 6 weeks of so much evidence, we weren't invited to be part of the panel. I wonder why that is. I wonder why that is. So we're going to go now because my time is limited. We're going to be talking about this again, believe me. But I want to talk quickly about two other matters that came up in my columns this week. My Wednesday column was about the war in Ukraine and why I think it's time for the Trudeau government to stop financing it and why I think we need peace in Ukraine and not a war that goes on and on and on endlessly. Have you heard of the doomsday clock? We used to hear about it all the time during the height of the Cold War and certainly during the years of President Ronald Reagan, a hero of mine who actually ended the Cold War through military strength. But the doomsday clock was always being mentioned because they thought, liberals, progressives thought Reagan was going to bomb Moscow or start a war with the Soviet Union. Of course, that never happened. It was actually Ronald Reagan that initiated serious talks with Mikhail Gorbachev to end the Cold War, because he knew the United States had an upper hand economically and militarily, and the Soviet Union could not keep up. It was on the verge of implosion. That's exactly what happened. So why are we fighting a proxy war against Russia and Ukraine? Now, I spent years as a public affairs officer in the military peddling the NATO talking points about how NATO is an organization of collective security that is containing communism in the Soviet bloc. And NATO was a very effective organization during the Cold War. It did contain communism. And in the years following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War, NATO was quite effective in peacemaking operations in Europe. And I was part of one of these operations in Bosnia in 1996, where we ended a civil war in the former Yugoslavia. NATO was very good at that. NATO was not very good at expanding endlessly, and so every nation in Europe is a member of NATO except Russia. That looks like a situation that could absolutely be catastrophic. Do you want to go to war for Albania, for Estonia, for Latvia, for Lithuania? Because these are all members of NATO now, and because of NATO, the NATO rule that an attack on one member nation is an attack on all. That means Canada, as a member of NATO, will have to go defend Lithuania if it's attacked by any other nation, including Russia. This is getting insane. Everybody can't be a member of NATO because the organization ceases to have a valid, legitimate objective or function. It suddenly becomes an organization that will fight a war just about everywhere and anywhere. And this is not working out well with Russia right now. We are on the verge of a nuclear cataclysm. We are marching towards Armageddon because we have got too many idiots in the media proclaiming that this is a war of freedom. That this is another war to make the world safe for democracy. That's what we said about the First World War. And look at a joke that turned out to be. All it did was sow the seeds of the Second World War and enable Nazism and Adolf Hitler. But Ukraine is not a model democratic state. It is a corrupt state ruled by oligarchs in the same manner that Russia is. They are taking the aid money in many cases and squandering it on personal projects. So the aid money is not even going to the military objectives that we're sending it to. And this is the problem. There's no accountability for where this money is going. And Canada has sent $1 billion in direct aid. It just sent 2 Leopard tanks to Ukraine. And by the way, don't expect to get them back. When you send tanks to a nation at war, they usually get ground up in the process. So don't expect them back. We've sent howitzers. We've sent a guided missile system that we don't even have ourselves. $460 million. We're purchasing it from the United States to send to Ukraine, and our own Canadian military doesn't have it. So what is going on here? It's clearly there was a violation of an agreement in 1990 by President George H.W. Bush, the first Bush. As the Soviet Union was collapsing, his Secretary of State, James Baker, promised the Soviet Union that NATO would not expand. Now, a year later, when the Soviet Union did collapse and the Russian Federation emerged, they dissolved the Warsaw Pact, which was a competing military alliance to NATO. They dissolved it, thinking that NATO was going to stop expanding and probably eventually be dissolved itself as Russia became part of the European continent and part of a democratic family of nations. That didn't work out very well, did it? But it could have if we had tried to keep Russia democratic and stop trying to wage a proxy war against it, and by encircling it with every other nation in Europe belonging to NATO. And this is a real problem. We need to stop the war in Ukraine. It was a horrible violation of international law by Russia, but it's not worth a nuclear war. I want to make that point very clear today. Now, I want to finish on one of my favorite notes. And this is the second column I wrote on this. It's out today. It's Thursday's column. It's about the new Islamophobia Czar, Amira El-Ghwabi. Now, I'm sure she's a very nice woman, and she worked as a columnist for the Toronto Star, and that really shows, believe me, in the kind of writing she does. But she recently had to apologize already because she called all Quebecers Islamophobists and said they were intolerant about Muslims. Well, what a stupid statement to make. How does she know that? Does she know every Quebecer? No, obviously not. But she's also made some other incredibly stupid statements. She actually trivialized the 9/11 terrorist attack against the Twin Towers in New York City by saying that the 9 years of Stephen Harper's government were worse for Muslims than that terrorist attack. What a ridiculous statement to make. What a smear on Prime Minister Stephen Harper and the people who worked for him. And you know why she says that? Because they were members of Stephen Harper's government who exposed and who criticized the barbaric practice of female genital mutilation that goes on in some Muslim communities. This is disgusting. It's not part of Canada. It is a complete violation of human rights and women's rights. And yet They don't want us to talk about that. What does this Islamophobia czar want us to talk about? Well, I mean, she really thinks that Canada Day is a farce because it's based on a Judeo-Christian storytelling. Now, this is outrageous. Why would somebody like this even want to work for the government of Canada? If she hates Canada this much, she hates our Judeo-Christian heritage, she hates our British heritage, the rule of law, and all of the rights that the British Commonwealth stood for, and we have inherited in this country: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and she's taking advantage of these things, obviously. The only reason she can make stupid statements like this is because we have freedom of speech and freedom of religion in Canada. Canada does not need an Islamophobia czar. Most Canadians are quite happy with working with, being friends with their Muslim neighbors. Muslims are actively contributing to our society. They're working and they're having success in Canada. They don't need some Islamophobia czar. And if we have an Islamophobia czar, why don't we have a Christophobe czar? Christians are often subject to terrible hate, especially from this Trudeau government. So as we conclude today, no, we do not need an Islamophobia czar. It's the last thing we need. All it's doing is sowing the seeds of intolerance and creating division, not unity. And it's not a healthy situation. But it's all part of Trudeau's identity politics. What Trudeau wants to do is divide Canadians and divide and conquer. But you know, Muslims are just like the rest of us. They're going to vote not based on whether or not we have an Islamophobia czar, but on high taxes, increased regulations, and freedom. They want freedom. Most Muslims just want freedom in this society. And the Liberal government's not giving them that. It's censoring them. It's giving them high taxes. It's creating inflation by high spending. And it's doubled the national debt in 7 years. And that's what Justin Trudeau is all about. So let's end it there for now. This is David Krayden speaking for the Western Standard senior parliamentary columnist. You've just been listening to Auto Exposed. And I want to tell you, we really love you being here. Bye for now.
Canadian Shooting Sports Association. Without the CSSA, our gun rights would have been taken long ago. These guys are on the front lines helping to draft smart and intelligent firearms regulations and legislation in Canada, and more importantly, educating the public about how we keep guns out of the hands of the wrong people. To become a member, it's absolutely worth every penny. You can become a Western Standard member for just $10 a month or $99 a year for unlimited